Hello, my name is Kaylee Pearlman, and this is my criminal justice project. My topic today is on the war on drugs. Now, I know what you must be thinking. You're probably thinking, hey, Kaylee, isn't the war on drugs actually about tackling actual drugs, such as heroin or cocaine, or even the massive and popular opioids? If you said any of those things, you are correct. While the war on drugs in its name is about tackling drugs and trying to get them off the streets and reduce the use and blah blah blah, that is a whole other presentation that I could talk about forever. However, for the purpose of this project, I am going to be talking about the hidden agenda underneath the so called war on drugs, which is the hidden racism and criminalization of minority communities. So, to start, why was this war on drugs even declared? In this section, I will get into the three different presidents involved and how the war got to see what we see today. To start out, I have included the ever so popular and infamous quote by John L. Wirchman, who is involved with the former President Nixon. This quote is interesting because he literally mentions the hidden agenda. It reads, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Another part of this quote that he mentions, and I quote, "Did I know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So he literally admitted that the war was never about drugs, so why is it still going on? To understand that thought, let's get into the creation of the war, starting with the President Nixon era. According to the documentary The 13th, which I will mention a lot, which is also available on Netflix, Nixon once quotes, "We need a total war in the United States against the evil we see." This goes hand in hand with his political strategy, which was to be tough on crime. This strategy was really popular back in the day because people wanted to be protected from the criminals, and those criminals were being painted as blacks and Latinx individuals by the media. Because of this picture that was painted of these communities, crime became a replacement for race. So instead of criminalizing crime itself, they were focused on hyperfixating on the crimes certain races would commit more than others. At this time, they realized different drugs were associated with different races, and that is when drugs became what Nixon called public enemy number one. Now, this is a new concept of a drug war, and it was only introduced at this time. It was more of a rhetorical one rather than a literal one. So now we're moving into the Reagan era. This is when this rhetorical war on drugs started to become a literal one. This is when it was nationally declared as a war. In the documentary 13th, one of the interviewees actually made a good comparison on how Reagan declared this war on drugs, much like they did with the war on terror. At the same time, First Lady Nancy Reagan introduced the infamous Just Say No campaign. This is the same campaign we all remember from high school and middle school. They say just say no to drugs and the drug free spirit week, and that's all that I could remember. It seemed like this campaign was actually doing what people thought the drug war was supposed to do. It was educating the children of America on the harms of drugs and preaching about prevention. That was until crack cocaine began to sit in the hot seat. It was then that people started to criminalize crack versus powder cocaine, even though they're literally the same thing chemically. They only did this because crack cocaine was associated with black communities, while powder cocaine was associated with white communities. This further pushed the hidden racist agenda behind the so-called war on drugs. This criminalization led to heavier sentences for the black and Latinx who were caught with any possession of cocaine. Again, in the 13th documentary, another interviewee mentioned, quote, "If you get caught with crack cocaine, you're basically going to prison for the rest of your life. But if you're white, you pretty much get a slap on the wrist." I feel that this really shows not only the harsh racist motives to the war, but also the fact that mass incarceration was beginning to increase rapidly. According to Deborah Small in 2001, in a country with quote unquote equal rights for all, one out of every three black men in their 20s are now in prison. And in the 13th documentary, in 1990, almost 1,179,200 people were in prisons. Something interesting that the documentary mentions is that they are locked up in the land of the free, considering the United States houses 25% of the world's prisoners, which is honestly crazy to me. So now we're moving into the Bill Clinton era. This era is a doozy. Clinton basically made the things that we see today on the streets and in the prisons. To start out, he made the three strikes law. This law basically says that if you have two prior felonies or just violent convictions, if you are convicted again of a felony, you're out and sent to prison for life. This law makes sure that the communities who are over policed for their entire lives and basically always have a record, if they are caught with any drugs on them, they will go to prison for the rest of their lives. The next thing that Clinton gave to the war was the mandatory minimum sentences. This makes sure that the judges won't have any discretion in the sentencing process and will just either give the minimum or go up from there. This makes them use the 1986's Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which was established, and the racial disparity in the sentencing guidelines. This made it at 100 to 1, meaning that crack cocaine was 100 times longer to powder cocaine convictions. Next, to make sure that they stay in jail and basically stay a slave to the system, was the truth in sentencing. Clinton made this to make sure that prisoners would need to stay in for at least 85% of their sentence. This legislation would increase the mass incarceration problems and basically make sure that these individuals who fell victim to the system will stay in there for a crime that is based on racial stereotypes. The next thing that Clinton introduced was the 1994 federal crime bill. This was the bill that made what we see today on the streets. He deployed the latest technologies that the police still use today and also provided a lot of money to law enforcement so that they can basically get away with things that we now would think are abusive. Clinton also wanted to put a lot more officers on the streets. According to an article called Shackled and Chained, this crime bill was going to put 100,000 additional cops on the country's streets. These legislations introduced by Clinton put more Black and Latinx individuals in prison for the rest of their lives. They were taken from families and placed behind bars which were overcrowded and horrible conditions. Clinton, according to the documentary, did in fact apologize because he stated to the public that these did not do good to the people. However, some interviewees in the documentary mentioned that it was nice to hear that a president did admit their mistakes, but the damage was already done and there was no going back now. So according to Deborah Small, in the article The War on Drugs is a War on Racial Justice, Blacks constitute 13% of all drug abusers, but 35% of those are arrested for drug possession, and 55% of those are convicted, while 74 of them are sent to prison. I feel that these statistics really show how race plays a big role in convicting these individuals and goes hand in hand with mass incarceration. So lastly, we'll look at the results of this war. Now, I've talked a lot about mass incarceration and the criminalization of drugs, but how does that really relate to all back to racism and their hidden agenda? Firstly, I'm just going to mention how prison is basically slavery in a different font. So by this, I mean that prisons will use inmates to rebuild the economy for either free or for dirt cheap. And the documentary 13th mentions how this is basically slavery since slaves were meant to rebuild the economy. And that to me is how I feel that mass incarceration and the war on drugs relate. So now moving on to today's times, where do we see the war on drugs? Because it's basically everywhere. The drug laws that are established in the United States are enforced in a way that is extremely biased and racially motivated. We see this everywhere with unlawful stops and searches. Also, according to Hannah Cooper, she mentions that in the wake of several Black men and boys who are killed in the hands of the police, there are more social movements that are starting to bring to light the violent police strategies that were a direct result from Clinton's crime bills, such as the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. Why? Because that bill that Clinton apologized for, all it did was increase police brutality and make law enforcement more like the military, and it will continue to target the minority communities. And their excuse was drugs. So basically, they would arrest these individuals and just say that they had drugs on them or they suspected drugs, even though they did not. And with that in mind, the war on drugs will never end. It is a constant battle between race and the politically powerful. Doris Provine, in the article Race and Inequality in the War on Drugs, mentions that this war would not be a thing without societal racism and the manipulation of racial stereotypes in order to make drugs something society should fear. And this is still happening to this day in 2023, right in front of our eyes with the rise of fentanyl. It is a never-ending battle in a war that cannot be won. And that is all that I have for you guys today. These are my resources. Once again, I highly recommend the documentary 13th, which is available on Netflix. It is very, very good. And yeah, that is all that I have. Thank you so much for listening.